The House by Karen Suter. Empty, they say. Abandoned. Unsafe. It's been that way for so long no one remembers when the house was last in use. That's the only name I've heard for the old theater. I've checked town records. The library, newspapers, even the chatter of the internet is silent on the subject. I, too, am empty and unsafe. Soon I will crumble, although no one can see it. The whiskered, whiskey gents outside the pub are flattered to speak to the retired performer who's come to live in their town, but they become silent on mention of the house. "You don't want to go worrying about that place," Jim says. "It's been that way for years. Fall down soon, I shouldn't wonder. Wouldn't be safe, lady like you, poking round there." Jim is the most garrulous of the pub gents, but this is all I get out of him. I like to learn the history of any place I live in. My gents stay stubbornly silent. "Was it once the playhouse?" I ask. "Still is," one of the other men mutters. Jim shushes him and points his pipe at me. "You leave well alone. Just ghosts in there. You don't want to go joining them, do you?" I take no notice, drawn there. I squint at the edifice, the boarded-up windows, the stonework in need of repair. It's just an empty theater, the upper windows still swathed in tattered velvet. I picture the interior, front of house with grand stairway, cloakroom, and bars. The back, wider, deeper, housing the auditorium and stage. Haven't I performed in places just like this? I discover a window where the chipboard has rotted away and climb through. Summer is left behind as goosebumps rise on my skin. I inhale, hairspray, alcohol, sweat. I expect the auditorium doors to creak as I push them open. Instead, I glide inside. I'm unsurprised by the figure in the orchestra pit. No theater is ever truly empty. "Ah, Madeline," the conductor says. "We've been waiting for you. Are you ready?" I am. I mount the steps to the stage. I nod to the conductor. He smiles, although with lips rotted away it's a grimace, showing skull as well as teeth. The baton is raised, its wood as decayed as the fingers holding it. I hear the death rattle of the audience's expectant sigh. I take my last breath and sing. Hello, and welcome to No Extra Words, the Flash Fiction Podcast. My name is Chris Baker-Dersch. I'm your producer and editor. I could never write a spooky story. I actually tried when I did the summer camp episode back in July to write a ghost story, and it's just not something I'm good at. Fortunately, today, my contributors are. I actually thought about saving these two stories and doing them more as a Halloween, spooktacular special, something corny like that. But I was so struck by this line from The House, "Summer is left behind." This idea that as you walk into a spooky place, you leave all of the light and air of summer behind you. So it actually felt like this was a great time as we're moving into September, we're going from summer to fall, to get a little bit spookier and share these stories. Karen Suter actually wanted to record her story herself, which is an option we really wanted to offer, but she's having some voice troubles, so I hope she feels better, and I hope we did The House justice. I'm not going to try to do her Scottish accent. I know that would have added an element to it, but hopefully next time, and thank you so much, Karen, for sharing your story. Coming up next is Karen's website, karensuter.wordpress.com. Check our show notes for the correct spelling of her name. She does spooky as well as sexy flash fiction. It's awesome. I'm actually going to link right to the post where this story originally was because there's this great old picture of a theater that's awesome. Coming up next, Earl Hatsby presents Crawling Hand with a Gun. Stories come to No Extra Words in two ways. They're either submitted to us from our website, noextrawords.wordpress.com, or sometimes I go wandering around the internet and I look at flash fiction and I get in touch with those authors and ask if I can share their stories. That's what happened with Crawling Hand. I can't even remember how I found it. But I got in touch with Earl and said, hey, can I use your story? And he was hilarious. He got back to me and he said, I had forgotten all about that one. It had been sitting in his blog archive for 2 years or something. So he gave it a little edit and shined it up and shared it with us. And it's a fun one to end our sort of spooky episode with. The subtitle I'm giving this episode is The Things the Living Don't See. And that's really what Crawling Hand with a Gun is all about. I will see you all next week for episode 12. Happy listening here on No Extra Words. Crawling Hand with a Gun by Earl Hatsby. The crawling hand with a gun crept toward the man in the fancy leather reading chair. It wasn't just a hand. There were a few inches of forearm, too, pale and springy with hair, but this gave way soon enough to streamers and flaps of flesh. Twitching and quivering, it crabbed in the spaces between the room's dusty furnishings, somehow managing to drive the handgun along with it. The crackling fire glinted on the gun's silver barrel as the hand emerged from behind the davenport, and when it reached a point about 2 yards from where Anthony Schmiegel sat, adjacent to the ashy blue stone hearth, the crawling hand, with a gun, deftly shifted the .45 until its sights fixed on a large man. Schmiegel had witnessed the entire hand's approach and did nothing. He couldn't move. The moment he'd first caught sight of the thing on the floor, he fell prey to a paralyzing fear that had less to do with the personal danger implicit in the creature's high-caliber firearm and more to do with the likelihood that, after so many years on the brink of it, his overburdened mind had finally snapped. The snifter of absinthe clutched in his right hand probably hadn't helped matters. Frost cornered the window behind him, obscuring an otherwise serene vista of the empty moonlit beach, and as he sat there, gazing upon the thing on the floor, his breath punched from his lips in quick little clouds. Below, the crawling hand, with a gun, shifted its grip until its pointer finger found solid perches on the gun's trigger. Then, when it had everything lined up nice, the hand contracted all the necessary muscles. The gun discharged with a riotous crash. The kickback spun the hand counterclockwise 90 degrees. Some blood from the forearm's flesh streamers spritzed the smooth oak legs of a nearby chair. The precariously placed glass bottle on the hearth from which Schmiegel had thrice refilled his snifter toppled forward and rolled noisily to a stop. It was already mostly empty. Between Anthony's legs and the thick flesh of the leather reading chair there now showed a definite value-depreciating hole. His ears were still ringing as the acrid and sour smell of gunpowder reached his nostrils. That's what did it. Schmiegel's jaw dropped like an attic door, and he issued the most appalling high-pitched cry a man of his bulk could possibly generate without the benefit of helium, or castration. A damp spot bloomed in the crotch of his slacks, throwing twirls of steam into the chilly air to commingle with the black smoke of singed leather. The crawling hand, with a gun, crawled and dragged its way back to firing position and, seeming to understand there was no great rush, trained the gun with far greater care than before on the man's bosom. When the hand was good and ready, it pulled the trigger. Click! No more cartridges. For a moment the hand bobbed irresolutely on the wrist, as if, for the very first time, it were considering the technicalities of reloading a firearm with only 5 fingers. But in moments the crawling hand, with a gun, seemed to understand that the cartridge crisis wasn't going to hamper its devilish agenda after all. The moment the gun's hammer had clicked uselessly into the cylinder, Schmiegel's heart, already under duress from supporting such rotundity in the first place, simply burst. In the chair by the window the man now sat, bolt upright, his eyes bulging glass orbs, his stark expression frozen solid in a visage of blood-curdling fright. The fingers with which he'd been cradling the snifter of absinthe had hardened into gnarled tree roots. His tongue had stiffened and planked sideways in his gaping mouth. It was in this frightful posture that the other gentlemen of the mono-clad Manatee Beach Club found him later the next day. And not a one of them noticed a smear of blood along the floorboards, nor a bullet hole in the chair. When it had left, the crawling hand, with a gun, cleanly restored the room to as it was before, with just one curious exception. The glass bottle on the hearth still rested on its side. It was mostly empty.